Hello and welcome to the CSN3M Mindset Monday podcast. I'm Andrew Wade with Case Specific Nutrition. On this channel, we focus on the three M's: mindsets, myth busting, and mentoring, all as they pertain to health and nutrition. On today's episode of CSN3M, we're going to be going back to our roots a little bit, and we're going to be discussing bioenergetics. And when I say back to our roots, what I mean by that is lately we've been doing a lot of behavioral and kind of big picture thinking in terms of our more recent episodes, focusing on things like our behaviors as well as hacking our brain. So a lot of really, hopefully interesting topics, but they're all kind of that big picture and don't really step into the nitty gritty of nutrition specifically. And so since I am a dietitian as my base training, I think it was, I thought it was time for us to get back into a more nutrition focused podcast. So I wanted to start today by digging into bioenergetics, which is a word that most people have probably not heard, but is something that I feel like most people would benefit from having a basic understanding of, because it does give us an understanding of how to fuel ourselves, how our body works, and also how to navigate some of the nutrition-related information and marketing and culture that exists out in the world today. So bioenergetics, simply stated, is the observation of how our body utilizes and burns fuel. And so when I start there, I think that it's really good for us to do almost a bioenergetics 101, which is to start really at some of the basic things that I think are basic to most dietitians and other medical professionals that have an exposure to physiology and biochemistry, but might not be something that the typical person knows on a daily basis. I know over the years, as I've spoken in groups, I used to do a speaker session for a couple medical facilities, and this I always started with an energy-based education in my talks. And over the course of the 5 years I did the talk, I want to say probably 50 times, I only had one person that ever really truly had an actual understanding going into the discussion of what I'm about to sort of explain and break down. So definitely some information that a lot of people don't have that I think that many people would benefit from having. So we all, or most of us, know that we burn calories. And the only reason we would probably know that is because it's talked about regularly. Treadmills and workout equipment shows you calorie burn. And then we know on the other side of things that food contains calories, or at least it would appear to when we go to a fast food restaurant and the calories are listed on the menu. But most people don't actually know what a calorie is. And I've always found this to be kind of funny because it comes up in day-to-day conversations. It's something that gets passed around and joked around with. It's something that gets, for many people, tracked or monitored, or even at times obsessed over. But most people really don't have a clear picture of what the number is that they're actually discussing. And once again, I think knowledge can be power. I think it can also help us better understand the actions we are taking, and might even also steer us into a place of having a better idea of what actions we might want to take. So to start with the base, a calorie is a measure of heat. And so it is a unit of energy, but it's actually a unit of energy that measures heat specifically. And so the reason that's important is because we don't really eat calories, we burn calories. So our body's burn has a measure, and that measure can be measured in calories expended. And so a way to think about it is I'm currently sitting in a room that's air conditioned at 68 degrees, and my body temperature, plus or minus a couple decimals, is around 98.6 degrees. And so my 180 pound body is producing 30 degrees of heat in addition to what is in my environment. That heat production is measured in calories. And if I just laid still in that room for 24 hours, I would be producing 30 plus degrees of heat for 24 hours. And that's the heat that's produced from my heart beating, my brain thinking, my nerves functioning, my cells dividing, my organs functioning, my body being alive. And that basic caloric burn is called our basal metabolic rate, or our BMR for short. For most people, your BMR is about 70% of the calories, maybe even 80% of the calories you burn on a daily basis. The more active you are, the more you exercise. If you're an athlete, for example, that spends a lot of time training, your calorie burn can get quite high, and your BMR does not change. It remains the base, unless you increase muscle mass, unless you build more muscle, in which case you have more cells that are burning, which means your basal metabolic rate goes up. But at base, with nothing else changing, our BMR doesn't change, but we can have calories expended or heat produced from working out. And it's something simple to think about, but when you exercise, what happens? You get hot and you sweat. So when you exercise, your body heat increases, which means you are burning more calories, right? Your measure of heat increases. And that measure of heat and that caloric expense leads to your body utilizing more nutrients. And from there, we need to feed. And so that's where this becomes an important turn, is if we can recognize that calories are not a measure of what we eat, it's actually a measure of what we burn. All of a sudden, we have to look at the current perspective in the United States, which is a fear of calories, a restriction of calories, and recognize that it's largely based on a misunderstanding of what calories are and what they're for. Our body burns energy so that it can thrive, so that it can be alive, so that it can do all the things you want to do. And that burn is no different than the burn of a factory that has a smokestack with smoke coming out of it. When we talk about calorie expense, we're talking about the smoke in the smokestack. What we're not looking at is all the things that are making the smoke. We're not looking at all the systems and all the machines and all the processes that make that smoke. And that's where we have to remember that our calorie burn comes from two things. One, our cells and our body wanting to exist. And then two, the fuel that actually lets them exist. So just like you don't get smoke coming out of a smokestack at a factory without having fuel to burn, our body does not have the same burn if we do not have enough fuel. And so that calorie burn that we can look at is only present if we are actually eating. And the moment we eat less and less, our calorie burn goes down further and further. Our body conserves and stops doing certain things. And at times there can be use of fat reserves, right? We have two reserve systems in our body. We have our carbohydrate or our glycogen system, and then we have our fat reserves. And our carbohydrates, when we eat carbohydrates, they initially store in our liver and in our muscles as something called glycogen. And that's a way to think about it, is that's our checking account. That's a really easy to tap into resource that our muscles can utilize. And then we have a savings account, and that's our fat stores. And our fat stores serve many purposes. We actually have essential fat that is not meant to be used for energy, but is instead meant to be used to help us create hormones and manage our hormonal systems and kind of communicate as a pathway throughout our entire body. So we have that essential fat that most people don't realize exists and don't understand the importance of. We also have the essential fat that cushions our organs and makes sure that when we get, if we get into a car accident, our seatbelt doesn't explode our spleen. And then we have our actual fat reserves, which are the energy reserves, the extra energy the body will keep so that in instance of being underfed or being, in danger or needing to, basically survive, the body has some reserves that it can tap into, and it'll tap into those gradually if there's inadequate food available. That said, the body does multiple things, right? If we aren't putting the food in, the body will burn a little bit less. And the sad part about that is that means caloric restriction slows down our body's ability to do things. And so if you've ever or know somebody that that your friends are close with that is on a diet or under eating or calorically restricting, particularly if they're restricting a lot, like doing a really low calorie diet, they probably are always cold or mention that they're always cold. You might notice that sometimes their lips are blue, and that's an example of your body being colder, aka producing less heat. And if you're producing less heat, that means you're doing what? Yes, you are expending less calories. And so our system is a really, really simple one. It's we eat food and think of it as the fuel that goes into the factory. Our body then burns said fuel, and that is what allows all of the factories to produce what they produce. Your heart factory produces heart rhythm that allows your heart to beat. Your brain produces thoughts and dreams and opinions, and your organs do their various processes. The liver detoxifies, the kidneys filter, and so on and so forth. And so we put the food in, the body utilizes it so that it can exist, so the factory can stay on, and all of those things happening have an expense of body heat. And so we run at 98.6 degrees on average, which is our metabolic rate. That is the measure of our base caloric expense before we make ourselves hotter by exercising, as an example. And that is the base system. And so some things to stop there before we break it down even further is to recognize that calories are not consumed, they are actually burned. Calorie counts on menus are basically saying your body would burn about this much of this, or use this food to burn this much. So it's meant to be a numeric translation, but now that you understand that, it might be easier to understand that those might not do the same thing in all people. Some people might be more apt to burn a little more efficiently. Some people might be apt to burn a little bit less efficiently. There's even been studies that have showed, a bowl of Cheerios for 120 calories. Some people only burn 100 calories or get 100 calories of burn, 100 calories, aka 100 units of heat burned from it, while some others can get even more. And so there is slight variance in this caloric measure, which is why it can be a very basic tool that can give people reference points and guidance, but in many ways falls short when we're trying to actually be, truly in a place of understanding. So when we look at calories as the smokestack, and we said that food is the firewood or the coal or the hopefully the some more sustainable form of energy, whatever energy is being used in the factory, we have to ask, what is our body burning? What's the firewood, so to speak, that's creating the smoke? And the firewood is the food, but in particular, it's three main things. It's our carbohydrates, it's our fats, and it's our proteins. So carbs, fats, and proteins are what are called our macronutrients. And those macronutrients are what our body uses to burn for caloric, basically for caloric expense. It's what our body utilizes as fuel. So it's worth noting, though, that our body kind of has a hierarchy. Our body utilizes carbs and fats as our dominant fuel sources. And then it uses protein as sort of an emergency secondary fuel source if we don't have enough of either of the other two. And so really, when we look at what we're burning, we are burning carbs and we're burning fats. Now, all of a sudden, the reason why low carb diets and low fat diets exist start to make sense, because it's the basic observation of, if I'm trying to control my energy intake, let's control one of the two things that provide me with energy. Now, from the caloric discussion earlier, we can remember that any restriction is going to immediately lead to some sort of reduced burn, which means fingernail growth will slow down, hair growth slows down and isn't as thick. Certain aspects, the body temperature might drop a little bit. Our body it's not as active, it doesn't do as much. But then there also, because of the absence of a nutrient, like a carbohydrate or a fat, other things happen. Our body does dip into some of our energy reserves, our glycogen stores, as I mentioned earlier, and some of our fat stores. Anybody that you've ever met that's gone on a ketogenic diet, and that is a low carb, high fat diet, as you can probably imagine, the first thing that happens on that diet is your body burns all of its glycogen, all of its carb stores in the muscle and in the liver. And that usually is about 8 pounds. And so most people lose 6 to 10 pounds in that first week or two of a ketogenic diet, but it's not actually body fat. It's actually just carbohydrates and water mostly. And those carbohydrates were your checking account. So you just zeroed out your checking account. And that checking account is the thing that's meant to help keep your energy levels stable, keep your blood sugar stable while you're sleeping. It's also the reserve that allows your metabolism to take place, because carbohydrates do boost our metabolism in a lot of ways. And so we can hear where there's some complications to pretty much every diet that could exist when we start to manipulate or restrict or reduce. But at base, it's worth noting that that the carbohydrates and fats for most people, we burn them at the same time. So our body utilizes the two. And so bioenergetics is the observation of how these burn. And I like to look at this from sit to sprint. So when we are sitting down, as I am now as I record this podcast, my body is burning calories, right? I'm sitting in a room, heart's beating, brain's thinking, check and check. So calories are being expended. And in this more sedentary state, my body is burning around 2/3 or 66% of the calories being burned are coming from fat, and 33% is coming from carbohydrate. And so when we do not have activity, or when our muscles are not being engaged, we actually burn more fat than we do carbohydrates in terms of total burn. Now, the rate of burn is a little slow, right? Because right now my body's only burning to keep the lights on, so to speak, right? To keep the body alive. It's not trying to climb a mountain or, do some sort of explosive movement. And so it's just like a nice steady basal rate. That's why it's called your basal metabolic rate. When I stand up, the carbohydrate burn increases slightly. When I walk, it increases slightly, then jog increases more. By the time I'm sprinting, if I'm going as hard as I can, 100% effort, my body is actually burning 100% carbohydrate. It cannot burn fat in that peak effort state. And so from sit to sprint, our body goes from 33% carb burn to 100% carb burn, and we go from 66% fat burn down to 0% fat burn. So for those of you that have ever been on a piece of cardio equipment and you've noticed that there's a heart rate zone, and they call it the fat burn zone, that fat burn zone is the point at which you get to almost a place where you're at what you would consider the ratio of largest calorie burn from fat. And so it's not the largest calorie burn. We've all had really intense workouts where we're going as hard as we can and dripping sweat, heart rates through the roof. Those are the workouts that burn the most calories, but they actually burn mostly carbohydrate. And that's why you see athletes, when they're performing at their peak, utilizing fuels like Gatorade and other carbohydrates. That fat burn zone that's on a treadmill is actually a heart rate of around 120 to 130. And what that is, that's the point at which we're burning about 60% carb, 40% fat. And so even though we're still carb dominant in that scenario, the 40% fat burn is high, and then the rate of burn is higher compared to a heart rate of, my resting heart rate right now is about 55. So at a resting heart rate of 55, I'm not burning as much as I would be in terms of total energy expense as if my heart rate was at 120. That 55 to 120 is blood getting sent to my muscles and to my brain so that my body can respond to whatever's going on. And as a result, all my systems are working harder. My blood vessels and my cardiovascular system's working harder. My lungs are working harder. My brain and my nerve systems are working harder. My muscles are working harder. And because all of that is working harder, there's more fuel being burned. And so more carbohydrate and more fats in general. And so that fat burn zone is actually considered that sweet spot where your rate of calorie burn and percent fat burn is sort of at its max. And so you can actually, that graph that I said where you go from 33 to 100% carb, 66 to 0% fat, when those two lines cross one another, that's actually considered a person's fat burn zone, or their kind of targeted point at which they're maximizing their utilization of fat. So that is a good place to once again stop and recognize that, okay, so far we've broken down what calories are doing, what they actually are, what our body does with them, or how it's related to them. We've then started to look at, okay, calories are the smoke coming out of the chimney of the factory. What's the factory burning? And the answer is it's burning carbohydrates and fats, and it's burning them in a varied ratio that's heavily dependent on activity. And so we can see why the more sedentary populations, less active people, are being recommended low carbohydrate diets, where athletes tend to be recommended higher carbohydrate diets. The reason for that is carbohydrates are something that burn by our muscle, and our muscles prefer carbohydrate. They work at their peak point using carbohydrate. And so that's why there's that common recommendation. It's worth noting that our brain also uses sugar. In fact, our brain cannot use fat directly, and it cannot use protein directly as energy. And this is where we can sort of do a little bit of an aside to the ketogenic diet. So our brain uses glucose or sugar to think and to function. And if we remove the carbohydrates from your diet and say we're on more of an Atkins style diet, which is just a low carb diet that has fats and proteins in it, your body will actually start to take protein and convert some of that protein into sugar so that the brain has fuel. And that kind of raises a flag to the body and tells it, hey, the body's not burning an optimal fuel, it's burning a secondary fuel, slow things down, which is why people that did the Atkins diet probably noticed over the years, after about 6 months or so, and a lot of the research showed this as well, that the rate of weight loss and energy levels and sort of the benefits of the diet kind of level off and flatline and kind of crash in some people. And that's why, is because the body's using its non-ideal fuel source. So then we go a step further, which is to say, well, what if we were restricting carbohydrates and then we were moderating protein, so not eating excess protein either, and instead we increased our fat intake? Well, then our body will take fat and it will break it down, and a byproduct of that breakdown is ketone bodies or ketones. And those ketones are what then can be used by the brain for fuel. For anybody that's ever done a ketogenic diet, when you have what they call the keto flu, which is when you get headachy and a little bit sluggish and the brain gets foggy, that's the point at which you've emptied all of your carb stores, your brain has no carbohydrate to utilize, and you haven't gotten to the point that you've developed ketones yet, because it takes about 48 hours to really spike ketones at an adequate level for brain function. So you get this foggy brain running out of energy, aka the brain factory doesn't have fuel, so the smokestack is not churning out output, right? And then once ketones get produced, ketones start getting utilized, the fogginess clears, the brain starts fueling and utilizing ketones, and we are now in a ketogenic state. And so once again, we can see where understanding bioenergetics allows you to explain almost every diet that exists, every consideration. And it doesn't dig into why there are so many diets. And I will recognize and reference some previous podcasts I did that kind of look at and investigate why varying diets exist and why there might be a spectrum of diets that, are good for certain people, or, what diets are composed of at least. So it's worth at least acknowledging or seeing why our body burns what it does, and also sort of recognize this in sort of better understanding what you're actually listening to, what you're actually paying attention to. Because, for example, right now, I get people all the time that are hearing about these ketone supplements that give a whole bunch of energy. Well, ketone supplements are just ketones, so they're not fat. They're fat that's been already broken down and its metabolite, the ketone bodies, which are actually a salt type, but they're just that ketone. And so the brain would use them if there was no sugar present. But if you're somebody that eats carbohydrates and you take a ketone supplement, it's not going to do anything. Your body doesn't use ketones when carbohydrates are present because it has glucose to use. And so what ends up happening is your body pees out those ketones. Well, if anybody knows how you measure how you're in ketosis, you're going to start laughing at this point, because the way you measure ketosis is by measuring the ketones in your urine. But really, the ketones in your urine are supposed to come from the fat that you're eating getting broken down and turned into ketones, not just taking ketones and peeing them out. That's not to say that ketone supplements don't benefit those that are in a ketogenic state or utilizing fat as fuel. It's simply to note that it's an example of recognizing marketing at its finest, where now these ketone supplements are sweeping the nation, and you have people not even making their own ketones or utilizing ketones, and not knowing that ketones are our third energy choice, taking these products thinking that they're actually going to do something for them, when in fact their body is utilizing other energy sources, preferably in the first place, and they're just basically paying for expensive pee. So once again, we have a lot of things unpacked in this podcast, but the basic behind the bioenergetics is that observation of how our body burns, and the fact that it utilizes mostly carbohydrates and fats in varied ratios. And that variance in ratio in part can be based on activity level. And that's going to help us balance this effort of performance and also balance our checking and savings account, right? Our carbohydrate stores and our fat stores. But hopefully the overarching message is to understand and realize that all this effort that people place on manipulating the scale and manipulating your weight are really oversimplified, right? Oh, I'm going to cut carbs. Look, I lost 6 pounds. And then they have no real comprehension of what they just did. They just depleted glycogen stores, which are what signal our body that there's adequate fuel and give us a metabolism and what stabilize our blood sugar. So in doing something that they perceive as positive, they've really done something in some ways quite negative, right? Set the body up to be in a conserved state instead of a fueled state. And so, and then people that go into a ketogenic diet start to develop this impaired relationship, thinking carbohydrates are not good for them or are bad for them, and start to really misunderstand the use of ketones in a lot of ways and overly rely on protein, which a lot of times people in ketosis end up eating too much protein, and that actually stalls them and takes them out of ketosis because once again their body will use protein as sugar instead of ketones because it'd rather use sugar for your brain, and your brain uses about 120 grams of carbohydrates per day. And so traditional lower carb diets for sedentary people tend to be 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates, and that's because that's enough to fuel the brain. And ideally, those carbohydrates are coming from a variety of sources with some really good fruits and vegetables and starches and even, some whole grains that allow the body to digest slowly and give good fuel in a steady kind of time-released manner to the brain, which is why we talk about trying to spread food out and have meals that are balanced so that the body can receive the fuel and then put it to work appropriately. It can put it to the right factories. The factories can do what they need to do with it. And when we have adequate fuel coming in, when our body's in an appropriately fed state, there's glycogen stores that are telling the body, hey, we have a protection safety net, so burn away, do your thing. We have some fat stores that say, hey, we have adequate for hormonal purposes and for the physical safety of the body, and we also have some extra reserves if we need, so burn away, and our metabolism thrives, and as a result our muscles recover better, our brain thinks more clearly, our body recovers better, our hair is thick, our skin is skin doesn't dry out, our fingernails are strong. All things about the body can benefit when instead of looking at calories as the thing we restrict, we instead start to look at it as the thing we expend and the thing that basically is the smoke from the firewood that we place on the fire that is our body. Now, this podcast, I will note and will allude that I have every intention of going more into things like a ketogenic diet in more detail in the future, because there's more detail there in that specific dietary protocol. There's also a lot of research in that area of why people might do it. I will just note that it is not meant to be something that a majority of people do. There are some hormonal influences in this entire process, which I kind of mentioned earlier. It's why the same cup of Cheerios could burn a little bit more or a little bit less for one person or another. And it's also why some people are more susceptible to, in the presence of carbohydrates, their body does not burn carbohydrates and fat as equally. It actually tends to burn the carbohydrates and overly rely on the carbohydrates and burn less of the fat, which can lead to increased hunger over time and can lead to hormonal dysfunction in the name of insulin, insulin is our main hormone that responds when we eat carbohydrate. And insulin is a hormone that tells the body to store and that food is coming. And it also is the thing that tells the body, hey, we don't need to burn fat right now, we have carbohydrate. And some people, not a majority of people, but some people, their body does not have the same or more traditional responses of insulin, and so they become insulin resistant, in which case their body starts to respond to carbohydrates in a sort of an inappropriate way, and that leads to some metabolic changes and can lead to changes in appetite and body composition and all the above. And that's where the ketogenic diet is currently being researched and utilized and tested and sort of observed, for its use in helping correct that or helping overcome certain hormonal barriers that might be causing the metabolism to misbehave. So it is worth noting that there's a reason I called this Bioenergetics 101. It's to understand that our body burns carbohydrates and fat as energy. Most of us burn them simultaneously. There are hormonal irregularities that can lead to the body becoming overly reliant on carbohydrate and as a result inhibiting utilization of fat properly. And that can have some symptoms and developments over time that might lead to some dietary protocols and interventions. But in those cases, I'll also note that it's rare that a ketogenic diet is the long-term solution. It might just be the base or the reset or a tool utilized to help try and get the body to basically reset certain hormones like adiponectin and leptin over the course of a multi-phase intervention that actually leads to a type of reverse diet, which is another way of saying, hey, let's wake up the metabolism and encourage it to burn all things so that we can really thrive, because we are our best when we are fueling from all areas. And again, I've worked with hundreds of people on this exact topic over the years. And it's really fascinating to see how different bodies can respond, from the sedentary individual all the way to the athlete. And then for those who have the hormonal variance that leads to their body burning a little bit differently. But regardless of who you are in that equation, I think there's some value in remembering that your body does burn and you do need to fuel it. And the fuel really should come from carbohydrates and fats. And within the realm of carbohydrates, we have to remember that they are a spectrum of foods, all the way from simple things like blueberries to vegetables like broccoli and peppers and onions and zucchini and even spinach, all the way to your starches like your corns and potatoes, and your grains like your oats and your wheat. And your rye and your breads and your cereals. And so carbohydrates are a very broad and diverse spectrum, but that fueling type is very, very useful for the body. And the more we move, the better we use it. And our fats, our body utilizes dietary fats, and we like a variety of those as well. Our body likes to have some omega-3 and omega-6 and monounsaturated fats, and it likes to utilize them for different systems and different processes in the body. And it allows our giant complex factory with all sorts of organs and systems with a lot of different chimneys burning to use the fuel that they need to use so that they can do their job the best for you so that you can be your best. And the only piece I would end on is we can start to kind of investigate how people are trying to manipulate the use of this system. So we can see our body, our culture doing low carb diets as an attempt to try and get the body to burn more fat. We can see people going on low fat diets as an attempt to have the body rely less on dietary fat and more on body fat if needed. And then we can also see things like fasted cardio and ketone supplements, where while it is true that fasted cardio will technically burn more fat, the reason for that is because in absence of your glycogen, your body runs out of carb stores and then has to rely on fats, but ketones don't get made right away. It takes some time for our body to make them. And so we end up just getting less energy, which means we are not as strong, we're not as powerful. And while that can lead to us technically burning a higher percent fat, the big question is, why are you exercising? And so I see this a lot where athletes are starting to fall into this idea of doing fasted cardio, but they're misinterpreting the purpose of their exercise. The purpose of exercise for an athlete is to perform. It's to drive the body to condition. It's to make the muscles stronger. It's to make them more resilient. It's to allow them to utilize fuel more efficiently and oxygen more efficiently. And we do that when we have food and fuel in our system. And so bioenergetics is what guides us based on our goals. If I sit down with an athlete, I'm going to utilize bioenergetics to make sure we're allowing them to perform. If I sit down with someone who has hormonal barriers and is dealing with health issues, I'm going to utilize bioenergetics to help optimize their metabolism, support their body to thrive and burn so that we can get the body into a good state where it's doing what it should be doing. And as a result, they're feeling better. So I hope this has been an interesting Bioenergetics 101 podcast for the day. I promise to go into further detail on some of the we'll call them side alley topics I've alluded to, like the ketogenic diet and the role of insulin and some of the other things that are that I mentioned in this podcast. But for now, I'd like to thank you for listening and remind you to please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, as well as share this podcast with a friend or a loved one on social media, tagging Spread the Health, our company hashtag. For more case-specific nutrition content, you can follow us on all social media at Case Specific Nutrition and check out our website, casespecificnutrition.com. We will be back next week with another CSN3M Mindset Monday.